This is Free to Exchange, the show where free markets and free-thinking scholars meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Today we're going to talk about the aftermath of war. How do countries recover after losing a major war or experiencing a civil war? Does foreign aid play an important role? How do the institutions adopted after a major war impact recovery? But first, we're going to look at the other side of the coin. How do foreign wars abroad impact domestic liberty at home? My first guest is Dr. Christopher Coyne. Dr. Coyne is an associate professor of economics at George Mason University and the associate director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center. He's the author of 4 books, including Perfecting Tyranny, which is the subject matter of our discussion today. Chris, welcome back to the show again.
Thank you, Ben. It's great to be here.
So, when free market types in the United States think about foreign policy and war, if they have a concern, it's often what are the costs of the war. Could you put that in context for us and say a little bit about it maybe?
Well, sure. So the main concern that many people have is the cost of operating the military. And the main part of that, of course, is the base budget of the Department of Defense, which is typically around $580 billion or so. And of course, once you add in other expenses for operating the military apparatus, it goes over $1 trillion a year that the U.S. spends. To put that in kind of global context of the base budget, the U.S. government spends about the equivalent of the next 6 or 7 countries combined on defense. And so the monetary costs are quite significant.
So that's really where we worry about our economic freedoms from a fiscal side of things for most free market people, is that we're going to have to tax or raise the money for this military budget that's as big, did you say, as the next 7 combined?
That's right. That's right.
But in the work that you do, you don't actually focus on those costs very much, do you?
Well, those costs are significant, but there's often overlooked costs, and this goes back to warnings, that, for instance, James Madison made back in the 1790s, where he said that, look, perhaps the gravest threat to public liberty is war, and he highlighted this issue of scale, that there are significant monetary costs in terms of taxes and budgetary implications. But the other thing he emphasizes, there's scope issues. That is that war expands the scope of government power over domestic life. And so a lot of people think of defense as happening abroad, of protecting liberties, but Madison and many since have warned that it can actually threaten our liberties at home as well.
So actually, it's nice that you're talking about Madison with this. Maybe it would be good to kind of step back in time before we get to the current day then. And what are some examples of this, of foreign wars or wars that the United States has fought before, where you find this other costs of war in terms of our domestic liberties at home?
Sure. Well, it turns out that they're all linked together, and many of the current concerns over civil liberties can be traced back decades, if not over a century. And one example of this is the surveillance state, which is something that's in the news now and has been since the war on terror started following the September 11th attacks. The origins of this actually can be traced back to the U.S. occupation of the Philippines in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And one of the things the U.S. government did in the Philippines to squash the insurgency was to set up a huge surveillance apparatus that collected detailed information on people's lives, their finances, their personal lives, and so on. And they used this information to manipulate people and to get them to do what they wanted in order to put down the broader insurgency.
But isn't that a good thing from a U.S. perspective?
Well, perhaps, but what happened after that ended is that the individuals that set up that apparatus came back to the United States. And of course, they had built up a skill set in surveilling and using these tools to control and manipulate people. And they started to actively lobby to set up a similar apparatus domestically. And eventually they succeeded in around 1915. And that is the origins of what today is the NSA and the broader surveillance state. The issue here, of course, is that in principle, these things are to be used to protect American citizens, to protect our rights and liberties. But of course, when you set this apparatus up, it is such a powerful, centralized force that it can and has been used historically against domestic citizens.
In particular, the stuff going back to 1950 and the early manifestations of this?
Sure. So as early as 1917, you get something called the American Black Chamber, MI8. And what they did was set up a fake business in New York City and entered into backroom deals with the major telecommunication companies, things like Western Union, because of course communications were wired. And they intercepted all of the messages that were coming in and out of the United States. There was no warrant, no oversight. And they basically had free access to U.S. communications, to the communications of private citizens. That has ebbed and flowed over time. During the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the FBI, the NSA, and the CIA engaged in surveillance as well as active break-ins of private property, of civil rights leaders, of politicians, of anti-war protesters. That, of course, got revealed publicly in the 70s. Supposed checks were put in place. But we realize now, in the wake of the Snowden revelations in 2012 and 2013, that those checks are at best parchment barriers. They are not firm constraints on abuses of power.
And the surveillance state isn't the only area where you've seen this historically or in modern times too. I know you are a scholar who's worked on stuff and studies Robert Higgs' work on the growth of government, and World War II is a big part of his story. Do you see a growth in the domestic costs of war after that one as well?
Sure. Well, after World War II, World War II itself, of course, was a massive mobilization, but after you get a state of permanent war and preparations for permanent war because, of course, of the Soviet threat or the perceived Soviet threat. And that apparatus doesn't just go away after war's end. And so you see other cases of what we refer to as the boomerang effect. And so you intervene abroad and it boomerangs back home. And so just two other brief examples. Please.
Just clarify what you mean by boomerang, because I think a lot of people are familiar with the idea of blowback, sure, where you strike somebody abroad and it brings violence back at home. Right. But that's not what you're talking about.
No, this is different. And so what we're talking about is that when the U.S. government intervenes abroad, it creates a laboratory, if you will, for the U.S. government to experiment in ways of controlling people, of shaping what people do and what they don't do. Because foreign intervention requires controlling other populations. Those interventions and those mechanisms and tools of control oftentimes return home, and that's the boomerang type effect, where the intervening nation throws the boomerang, but it doesn't just stay abroad, it comes back and affects domestic life.
All right, okay, go ahead then.
So two other very brief examples. One is military equipment, and so there is a tendency in the United States over the last several decades for local police departments to adopt military-grade equipment, all legally. This is legal. This is started with the war on drugs, and of course the war on drugs, one of the unintended consequences of that was to ramp up violence, and so the police met that by acquiring military equipment. But as part of the war on terror, military equipment has also been used, and that goes from hardware like guns, but also surveillance equipment, and that's used domestically now. That affects your and my life and the lives of other domestic citizens. On top of that, there is an increased expansion in the use of drones domestically. Drones were developed for use abroad, but they are now being used domestically, both by the Customs and Border Patrol, but also by the FBI and other bodies to surveil U.S. citizens with very little oversight or public transparency.
You know, Chris, I could imagine a kind of fiscal conservative kind of watching and say, yeah, I worry about the size of the military and how it affects my taxes, but all this other stuff this professor's saying, well, isn't that good? It's making us safer.
Sure, that in principle that can happen, but one of the things that people need to keep in mind is why government, on the one hand, can do good things, but often throughout history has done quite bad things. And that is because when you centralize power in the hands of a small group of people, the risk, of course, that you run is that they turn around and use that power and force against the very people they purport to protect. And that's happened throughout history, both in the United States and elsewhere. And so the risk we run is that by centralizing this power, by creating this set of institutions and institutional precedents over time, that in the future that power can be abused, and it can undermine the very liberties and freedoms that oftentimes we take for granted.
And this is what you worry about in the context of the war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last decade and a half.
That's exactly right. These are open-ended, never-ending wars. It's unclear what it means to win. And it's not like there's a authoritarian despot that's going to show up in America tomorrow, but it's these small, creeping little steps. Airport security and the way that people are treated and the way that their privacy is invaded, and it becomes normalized, and people become desensitized to it. And so things that would have been unacceptable, if not outright repugnant and obnoxious in the past, become a normal part of life, and people have this attitude, oh, I have nothing to hide, so that's fine if they read my email or have access to my bank accounts or the information in my personal information. But the question you have to ask yourself is what's going to happen when someone different is in power, and how they can use that to undermine your liberty, and not just your liberty, but the liberty of your children, your grandchildren, and so on.
I think that's a very timely observation given the change in power we've just had in the White House and shifting feelings among the American population. In our last minute or so here then, I think you're kind of driving at it now anyway, what do you think the main takeaway from thinking about the costs of war more broadly, the way you do in your research, is for people who are concerned with free markets, but freedom more generally in the United States?
Sure. So this is an important topic. So the first thing I think is to realize that the costs of foreign intervention are always going to be understated. Of course, there's the fiscal aspect. And as we all know, politicians severely understate the fiscal cost of policies they adopt. So that's the one thing to keep in mind. But even beyond that, the costs are going to be much longer term because of these institutional precedents that threaten liberty are going to be in place and affect life for years, if not decades after. And so kind of the implication of this is a default skepticism towards foreign interventions. The domestic life that we enjoy and the freedom that we enjoy is not immune to foreign intervention. And that requires us as citizens who value that freedom to be skeptical of things that threaten it. And the natural tendency is to think, okay, the U.S. military, U.S. defense, it is defending and protecting us. But a careful review of history shows that that's often not the case. And both understanding that history and being extremely wary of foreign interventions, no matter who is in charge, no matter which political party, is of crucial importance.
Well, thank you very much for sharing these observations with us today,
Well,
Chris.
thank you for having me, Ben. I appreciate it.
Thank you. We're moving the discussion abroad when we come back. How do countries recover that have lost a major war or experienced a civil war? Stick around.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Colin O'Reilly. Dr. O'Reilly is an assistant professor of economics at Creighton University. His research focuses on the economics of post-war reconstruction. Colin, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, most people understand, before they start listening to economists anyway, that wars are destructive. They destroy lives, they destroy resources. But every so often you see an economist write something about, well, war is good for the economy. Is there any truth to this?
Well, really, this is just a common fallacy here, right? War destroys lives, it destroys capital, it destroys roads and bridges, right? And this is not productive. This is destructive activity. I think a lot of people have this idea because they have something about World War II in their head, right? That World War II ended the Great Depression and therefore war must be helpful for the economy. But the United States was a really unique case in World War II. There was not a lot of destruction on U.S. soil. And so the U.S. got maybe some of the benefits of producing tanks or getting people back to work, but we didn't experience any of the negative sides of that from the destruction of lives and destruction of property.
Yeah, and this too is measuring output, not consumption.
Exactly.
People lived worse during World War II than the Great Depression, right?
Right. You had rationing. You had people, have talked to anybody that actually lived through that period, hear accounts of it. This was not a time of prosperity, right? This was a time of sacrifice and a time of suffering, right? Producing a tank does not really make us better off in terms of consumption, right? The tank is just designed to destroy something.
Yeah, it's producing a tank instead of an automobile.
Exactly, right? And quite literally that's what happened in terms of the auto industry during World War II.
So when wars destroy things, you might see measured GDP go up, but you're just replacing broken stuff.
Exactly, exactly.
So some people then will look at a war-torn country, so not like the US during World War II, but a place that's actually been bombed, invaded, where there's been destruction. They'll say, all its capital has been destroyed. If we want them to recover, we need to give them aid for investment. How well does this work at promoting recovery?
Sure. Well, at first glance, the logic seems fine, right? Oh, well, you destroyed a road or a bridge. Let's rebuild that road or a bridge with some foreign aid. But what this ignores is that we need to figure out how are we going to allocate that capital, right? And if we don't have the rules of the game, the governance, the institutions to allocate foreign aid capital successfully, that foreign aid may get used for unproductive activities or even destructive activities. There's actually some evidence that in some cases, foreign aid props up dictators, props up these despots that are just there to expropriate for their citizens instead of actually providing some kind of a public good or enforcing property rights and contracts.
So even after the war, it's meet the new boss, same as the old, and then the new guy gets aid to allocate for other reasons.
Absolutely, yeah. And we've actually also see evidence that sometimes aid winds up being contested, might actually be somewhat like oil resources. We see sometimes oil resources in countries with very weak institutions, rebel groups wind up trying to seize those diamonds or oil resources. Foreign aid can be a similar flow of cash that people are willing to fight over.
So there has to be some success stories. I mean, most people will think of post-World War II, actually, bombed out Germany,
right,
and we give them the Marshall Plan.
Exactly.
And that comes in and gives them foreign aid, and Germany's successful.
Well, and there's some layer of truth to this that maybe the Marshall Plan helped out, but the real question is, well, why did the Marshall Plan work? Well, Germany already had, and Japan already had, pretty decent governance prior to World War II, so those foundations for governance were already laid. And if you have good governance, you're going to allocate any kind of capital, whether it's foreign aid or private capital, to more productive uses. And then on top of that, we start to take an actual look at what happens in post-war Germany, and we see that the real success happens when some of the wartime restrictions are removed, right? We actually see that price controls are removed in Germany a lot earlier. You have rationing going on in England well into the 1950s.
So because Germany had good market institutions from before is what enables recovery later.
Yeah, I think institutions and governance are really part of the story here. In fact, I think they're the primary story, right? The post-war Germany still had a lot of the underlying history and culture and institutions that they had before the war. Was actually a decent system of governance, right? Contrast that with some of the conflicts that we see in sub-Saharan Africa, where you had an extremely weak state that was extremely corrupt beforehand. Right? After the war, you can throw all the capital you want at that, but you still have those underlying bad institutions and bad governance.
So since they've been war-torn and, kind of wiped the slate clean then, if aid in bad institutions doesn't work so well, why don't we just give them new institutions? Give them a U.S.-style constitution, say these are the rules of the game now, play by them.
Yeah, if only. It sounds like a great idea, a lot harder in practice. I think we think about things like the U.S. Constitution as the success story, and it certainly has been in a lot of ways, but transplanting those types of institutions are a lot harder, right? And the reason for that is that a country's context, the history that country has had, the culture that country has, the norms that are established in that society, those institutions, those support these more formal things like a constitution. If you don't have that foundation, what's built on that foundation is going to crumble. And so frequently we see in developing countries efforts, and well-meaning efforts, to improve institutions and add foreign aid to the mix, but if they're not built on a solid foundation, they're going to crumble.
Because the pieces of parchment don't enforce themselves.
Exactly.
So I know you've studied the particular case of Rwanda, something that many viewers will be at least a little bit familiar with, maybe at least of seeing the movie Hotel Rwanda, of knowing what a awful kind of civil conflict that they had there. They've been relatively successful in building out of that civil war, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Though if we look back in time, they weren't immediately successful. So we have the Rwandan genocide happens in 1994, and then for about a decade after that, you have 100,000 people locked up in prison that haven't been tried for the genocide crimes, just rotting there in prison. So these people don't have justice. They're in prison, right? They haven't been convicted of anything yet. The victims of the genocide that aren't in prison haven't gotten justice because these people haven't been tried. And if we look at this period in time, Rwanda's suffering. After about 10 years, they say, all right, we're going to try something new. We're going to bring back some local institutions.
But in this interim period, this 10 years before we get to the bringing back, did economic development occur? Did they become wealthier, or is this stagnant at the time?
Yeah, I mean, you have some recovery from the bottom of the genocide, but not real broad-based development. Nothing compared to what's happened in the past few years, or past, say, 5 to 10 years, where Rwanda has seen real broad-based development. increases in GDP, increases in living standards, all sorts of great improvements in health outcomes.
Okay, so how did they start making the transition from this stagnant, no recovery to doing better?
Well, so part of the genocide wound up killing almost all of the legal experts, judges, lawyers in the country. So they don't have this baseline legal system. And this was part of the problem. Now, to overcome this, they bring back this old dispute resolution system that existed in Rwanda for hundreds and hundreds of years called the Gacaca court system. And this is an informal system of justice, community-based justice, not what you'd see in a courtroom in the United States, let's say. And so they bring back these institutions that the people of Rwanda understand, that connect to their culture, that match up with their history, and they start to process those genocide cases through this Gacaca court system. And the results are amazing. They process all the court cases. The formal justice system starts to improve because it can allocate resources to business disputes and things like that rather than the genocide cases. So you have, at the same time, this success story of these informal institutions, and that winds up complementing some of the more formal traditional justice system that we'd be more familiar with in the United States.
And did they work in a sense of what we might think of as justice? I mean, was 100% of people convicted or 0% that would indicate that this is all just kind of a sham?
Overall, the results are very positive. Certainly, there's been some people that have criticized this as not being up to U.S. standards of justice. But we've got to think about the context here. You're talking about one of the poorest countries in the world. You're talking about a country that has none of the resources to administer justice. So once you recognize some of the constraints they faced, the Gacaca courts performed very well. They processed the genocide cases. There was minimal corruption. They did it in a timely manner, which is very important. Having timely justice is actually a really important feature of what often gets called transitional justice for these countries that have experienced some kind of violent conflict. And the results can be seen in terms of economic performance following.
Because then the formal institutions started mimicking the ways of these courts, or just were able to better focus their resources on what they should be doing?
I think a lot of it is resource allocation. I think that instead of sucking all of the resources to process the genocide cases, the formal court system could do what it was designed to do, which was to resolve individual disputes that didn't have anything to do with the genocide. And so you're able to reallocate resources to the formal justice system, and you also have people trust the system again, right? You have the people participate in these community-based courts, and this allows people to have some kind of confidence in institutions more broadly defined, whether those are the formal governance through the Rwandan government.
So to put you on the spot here with just a couple minutes left here of thinking, I mean, the U.S. has just had wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and withdrawal's been a problem.
Right.
What's the kind of general implications that you get from studying post-war reconstruction of what are the things that tend to make a place more successful or less successful, and how can we better operationalize it?
Sure. Well, I think primarily is that economic development is really critical to ending conflict. The best predictor of a conflict or violent conflict like a civil war is low GDP per person, low standard of living. So if we can set up some institutions that are going to allow countries to actually develop and raise their living standards, they're going to be able to recover, and they're going to be so much less likely to fall into what some scholars call the conflict trap, where you just keep having wars. So if you can reestablish some of your institutions, in particular legal institutions are important. We see success stories of reforms to the legal system in post-conflict countries. As I mentioned, Rwanda, El Salvador is another case of this, where you have broad-based reforms and you have much better rules of the game, and we see the economic performance follow from that.
All right, well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
People often think of foreign policy and issues of war as separate from economics. My two guests today showed how they're interrelated. My second guest, how economic development is crucial in post-war reconstruction and how to avoid future conflicts in those cases. And my first guest points out that the costs of war aren't merely the tax dollars that we pay to finance them, but also that innovations are going to be undertaken in order to wage a war that could come back and impact domestic liberties at home. Any rational calculation about whether a war might be desirable should take account of those costs in terms of lost liberties too. And once we do, that might, on the margin, tip us towards a less aggressive foreign policy. We'll see you next time.